Welcome back to The Word I Heard right here on the Emmanuel Mennonite YouTube channel. And I was thinking about this, Mark, we are the only Mennonite podcast in the lower Arkansas Valley of Colorado. How about that?
Wow.
That's our claim to fame. So it's a very small section, only Mennonite podcast though. I'm Derek Hutchison. I'm the pastor here at Emmanuel. This is Elder Mark Fisher. And we took a break last week because we had the Mennonite relief sale, and the last one here down in the valley, and it was a huge success. Congratulations to everybody who worked so hard. It was a huge success, just wonderful. Next year is going to be up in Castle Rock, but we are back, and we're talking about doubt. And my sermon this last week was, for those of you who haven't been following the podcast, you might be new to the podcast. I'm in a sermon series right now on the 12. We're talking about the disciples. So far, we've talked about Matthew, we've talked about James and John. And this last week, we talked about Thomas. And here was the thing that scared me. We talked a little bit off air before we came on. That Advent will be coming up at the beginning of December, December 3rd or 10th, 24th. Yeah, I think something like that, December 3rd. And so that means I have 4 weeks to get through 9 disciples.
Wow.
And so I have an idea for it. Obviously we're going to be talking about Judas at some time. We're going to be talking about Peter at some time. And then there is going to be a group called the Others that no one seems to remember. And we're going to talk about those just a little bit. But last week I had a sermon on Thomas, and it was called The Doubter, and the premise of my sermon was maybe we're being a little bit too hard on Thomas. And this whole idea of doubt, like you had said before we went on air, doubt versus faith, and that it's okay to doubt. So, when I started the sermon, how much did you think? Did it go where you wanted it to, or where you thought it was going to go?
I expected the doubt part.
Yeah.
The part that surprised me when you mentioned where he said, "My Lord and my God," and how his affirmation was really the best affirmation of the Bible, and that was a totally new idea. And so I always think of Thomas as doubting Thomas, so we can call him affirming Thomas because he had an affirmation that was even beyond Peter's, and I always thought of Peter's as the ultimate affirmation. So that was a new idea for me.
That was, as I studied during the week, it was new for me too, because I think what we do, or we have a tendency to do, is we skip right over that.
Yeah.
We may read it. But of course, we're talking about in John 20, I think it's 24 through 29, when Jesus comes in and Thomas touches the scars, the holes, the side, and has this epiphany, I guess it would be called, that's who you are. And so, that whole idea of him saying, "My Lord, my God," I think he gets the short end of the stick a lot of the time. So when you think of doubting Thomas, and we talked about this a little bit in the sermon, do you think it is prevalent in Christianity? Or at least in the local church, in the local congregant, the person sitting in the pew, to equate doubt with lessening of my faith. So in other words, if I doubt, do you think people grew up that way? If I doubt, then somehow I'm less than I thought than I'm supposed to be.
I looked through the Bible and saw what they had on doubt, and it came down to faith or doubt, and with faith is worshiping God. With doubt is sin, troubled, and condemned. So at least the Scripture showed that part of when you're doubting, you're not believing, and so I think it's natural to see doubt as rejecting God, or at least wanting God to want fireworks and somehow to prove Himself to us.
Is there a difference then? Can we equate, or is it too far of a jump to equate doubt with what I brought out in the sermon? Not so much Thomas doubting, but Thomas questioning. Is there a difference in your mind of doubting and questioning?
With doubting, it could be just a final destination where we're in doubt and maybe more challenging, or maybe just making that our there's agnostics that don't know if there's a God or not, and so doubting could lead to that position of not believing in God or not knowing if there is a God or not. But questioning, I think the man encountered Christ and said, "I believe," helped out my unbelief.
Help my unbelief. That's exactly right. And I look at it, and I didn't bring this out in the sermon, and of course that's one of the things that come out in the podcast. We start talking about the sermon, and I think to myself, gosh, I should have put that in. But there's a spectrum, isn't there? I mean, there is that. You talk about the individual who said, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." There is a spectrum of belief, questioning, doubting, and unbelief. I mean, would you agree with that or not? I mean, we slide on that, don't we? Because there has to be this doubt. To me, isn't that idea of just, okay, I've come to that's it, final answer. I've processed all the information that I have, and I don't believe. To me, that's unbelief, right? Doubt, to me, is I processed this information, and I'm just not convinced. I'm not there yet to say no, but I'm not convinced. I doubt it. It would have a tendency to say, and again, I had this in a previous sermon, or in the sermon draft. I was going to talk about a jury and reasonable doubt. That's where the sermon actually started for me, was reasonable doubt. What is that? Something that a human would look at and say, yeah, that's probably not true. That's probably not true. And then you slide over to this idea of questioning. The idea of, I have my belief, but you know what? I've got some holes in my thinking that need to be filled, because I've got some questions, to the idea of, yeah, I'm totally in. I buy this. And I think we slide on that. And I'm wondering if that's maybe where... do you think Thomas is, in this story, this whole story that we read, the whole idea of... do you think Thomas is a questioner, or do you think Thomas was a doubter?
When we come to the point of rejecting or really being closed to it, that's different than doubting. I think of my own walk with God, and even though I believe in God, there's always that, what if I'm wrong? What if it's just a fantasy? And
I'm glad you said that, because it's true.
Yes, and so I can't see us ever getting to the point where we're 100% bought in without at least some reservations.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to hear some of the other voices and think, well, maybe this is a fairy tale. Maybe we just are doing this to have something to feel good about and to believe in. But then it always comes down to, well, if there is no God, then what is there? And then you come to all the other things, and that's even more, more muddy, more confusing. And so, like Peter said, where else do we go? Only you have the way to eternal life. So even though we can buy in, I don't think we can ever get to the point where we're saying, I have no doubt.
Yeah. I would like to be at that point. I know people that they seem that they're at that point. Some of the very mature, older people of the church, sometimes you see them, and they're not always older people of the church, but those are the ones that I think of. That's just these prayer warriors. That's just like, it's going to be fine. God's going to be. And I look at them and I think, and I know they don't have that unwavering. I know they question. I know they doubt, but you don't see it, and you're like, I want to be like that. And they would probably sit at this table and say, yeah, I doubt all the time. It's like, how could you be like you are and show what you do and still have that doubt? And I think when you talk about this idea of Thomas, one of the things that was in the sermon that my wife and I, Christine and I, we talk about the sermon, and we spent a number of days on this going back and forth, and it's a small little thing, but it's one of those things that goes under the heading of questioning to me. We know in the story that Jesus appears to the disciples in the upper room. And before they can ask any questions, he shows them the scars. They're like, whoa, but Thomas wasn't there. And my burning question in my head that we talked about all the time that we don't know, where was he? Why wasn't he there? Was he specifically not there so that Jesus could, so this could happen? Where was he? And because really the disciples, I believe, were cowering up in the upper room. They were scared. They had lost their leader, their master, their rabbi. People around there were still hot from their crucifixion. And Thomas wasn't there. Thomas was either hiding someplace else. Thomas didn't care, and he was out amongst the people. Where was he?
And when Jesus came to the disciples, he appeared to them and said, "Why are you troubled? Why do you have doubts in your heart?" Mm-hmm. And so doubting Thomas wasn't the only disciple that had doubts. And so yet he has the label, but really when it came down to it, I remember with Peter and John, and I think, was it Peter was still kind of wondering, and and John was a little bit more firm with it,
right.
And so really it was a doubting.
Yeah, it was a doubt fest.
Yeah, of the 12, I'm sure there'd be more in the doubting camp than the believing camp. And
absolutely.
As far as we know it, maybe one.
Yeah, because we don't even get that in Scripture.
Yeah.
What we get is we have a group of 11, by this time, 11. And all we hear from them is that there is doubt in their hearts, there's doubt in their minds, there's doubt out of their mouths. We're not really given that one disciple that's sitting over there going, it's going to be fine, guys. It's okay. Don't worry. Remember what he said? Do you remember what he said? He's going to come back. He'll be back. Don't worry. We don't have that disciple. And one of the things that we've talked about in this whole sermon series is the idea that the disciples are human just like us. They're going to respond like we do, maybe with a little bit more faith, but in general, the acts of humanity and the beliefs and the ups and downs that we experience are going to be the same ones that they experience. I probably would have doubted. I probably would have thought, this is it. We were duped, not intentionally, maybe not have any malice against Jesus and like, oh, he is a liar type of thing, but just, this didn't end like I thought it was going to end. Because we have to remember, even though these disciples had walked with him for 3.5 years for, this whole idea of his entire ministry, and Jesus had continually told them, it's a different Messiah. It's a different, there had to be still in the back of their heads, because they grew up with this. This was the Jewish tradition. This was the Torah. This was it. They were waiting. The one thing they were waiting for, the return of the Messiah. We would be released from our bondage of the Romans, and we would have victory. And they had that idea of what Messiah was. And now they killed him so easily. He surrendered.
It wasn't long before then where James and John wanted to be at the right and left of the
That's right,
in
the
heaven.
sons of thunder.
And so I think, yeah, even though he kept saying, this isn't the kingdom you're expecting, I think they fully expected him to take over the nation, and they would
Exactly.
be his cabinet members. They
Yes.
would be his. They would
Yeah.
be the ones second in command, really. And
Yeah.
so I think that's why they were jockeying for position, because they wanted to be.
Yeah.
They wanted to be the next up. And so when this happened, I think they realized, okay, this wasn't what we expected, and they were hiding because they thought they would be next.
And no pun intended with the idea of Christmas and Jesus' birth. I'm not trying to make some sort of mixed metaphor analogy type thing. But it's almost as if you were a young child and your parents came to you and said, Christmas is canceled. You've been waiting and they didn't do it in July, so you had a chance to, it was Christmas Eve. And they come to you and you've been waiting and you're so exciting, and they said, you know what, Christmas is canceled. And this whole idea of, I've been waiting, just like you said, the whole idea with James and John. Yeah, we're going to be in heaven with Jesus. I'm going to sit at the right and the left of Jesus. This is going to be fantastic. After the Jews are released from their bondage and Jesus just kicks the tar out of the Romans. After we get this revenge that we have, after we get what's due to us, after all that is done, and we come to the end of our life, we're going to be up in heaven. And it didn't happen. And there had to be disappointment. There had to be shock. There had to be doubt. There had to be fear. All of those things, or why would they be in this upper room? Cowering. Cowering's a tough word. Hiding, I don't know. Probably doing the same thing that we were doing. It's like we put ourselves out on the line. Now this guy who does all the miracles is gone. The guy who kind of is in charge is gone. We're still here. They're going to come and get us and do to us exactly what they did to him.
They left all they had and followed him.
Yeah.
And so they gave it all up. And then all of a sudden they realized what happened, where
Exactly.
he was crucified and
Yeah.
we're next. And so, they had every reason to be terrified, really.
Yeah.
I think that's a very human, natural, reasonable response to realize that the guy in charge is gone and now we're next.
We're next. And so I get down to the sermon and I begin to talk about, and I reiterate it because it's a phrase that I used in the sermon over and over again. Jesus talks about it in verse 29 of John 20 when he says, Jesus told him, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. And my premise, or my point in the sermon, was that Jesus was looking all the way down through time, and he was looking at us. He was talking to us about that, because he couldn't have been talking about the disciples, because the disciples could see him. He wasn't just Thomas. He wasn't just calling Thomas out. He's talking about those in the future who are going to have to build their belief on testimony from other people. And at some point in time, you're going to have to believe without proof. I mean, Thomas had the proof right in front of him. And it's easy, I think, to say, well, it's easy for Thomas to believe. He got to touch the scars. Maybe. Surely it added to the belief. I don't think that's what his belief was built on. But you come down through us, and that's where I think we, as the body of Christ, struggle a lot now, is the idea, just like you started out this podcast, we started talking about the whole idea of, what if I'm wrong? Because all I have is my belief. That's all I have. I don't have. Now, don't get me wrong. There's anecdotal proof out there. There's historical writing proof. There's all kinds of proof. But at some point in time, you have to take somebody's word for it.
Years ago, there's I think it's Lee Strobel, if I remember
Lee Strobel,
right.
The Case for Christ.
Yeah, where he was
fantastic.
He was out to prove that there was no God. And so in the process of proving there's no God, he came to the conclusion that there is a God.
Yeah.
But he says there's enough in the Bible, there's enough in life that you can reasonably believe, but not enough to prove it. And that's where faith comes in.
Yes.
Because there's a part of it where you gather all the evidence and say, okay, I'm a believer, I buy in. And I believe God did that intentionally. He didn't want to just make it where people had no choice but to follow, but make enough where you can look at the evidence and then reach your conclusion.
And that's where my sermon started. The first draft did. It didn't go that way because as I moved on, it became more about a case for Christ and less about Thomas, but was the whole idea of, I believe, and Lee Strobel, who was a lawyer, I believe, says it too, and I had the case for Christ in front of me, was the whole idea of, he believed, I believe, that a jury could sit in front and say, beyond a reasonable doubt, what I believe is true. I mean, after looking at all of the evidence, a reasonable person would say, yeah, I think you got something there, you know, and yet, I think the rest of the world looks at us and believes us to be just out of our minds. How can you believe this fairy tale? And I think it's because people look at one piece and say, yeah, I can't buy into that. But when you look at this entire story, you look at it and you say, yeah, beyond a reasonable doubt. And so that's one of the things on this podcast is you kind of get a glimpse into my head of where sermons go up and down, and that's where it was going. I spent a number of days on that, and it took me to a place that kind of went away from Thomas, and so I didn't do that. But it would make for a great sermon, and maybe I'll do it sometime. So it was very interesting that you bring that up, because I had told Christine, we were driving in the car, I said, when we began, I said, I think I'm going to work about this reasonable doubt, and because of the play on words, that doubt is reasonable. You know, that whole idea. And so, yeah, I think Thomas, I think we miss the story, just like with all of these disciples. Hopefully that's one of the things we bring out in the podcast, is you miss the real story. Matthew's a tax collector who got turned. Yeah, but there's more than that. James and John, we look at the sons of thunders. Yeah, but there were more to them. Wait till we get to Judas. I don't know that a lot of people are going to agree. I don't know. We'll see. You look at Peter. There's more, and we have these brief glimpses, these snapshots of what we think the disciples were and how they reacted. And when we really start to look at them as humans, as just people, us, it changes.
Peter and Judas, they both came to the same point, but one went one direction, one went the other.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. There was that moment, wasn't there? There's that whole idea of it that happens with all of the disciples. And in the end, really the point of the 12 and the sermon series is that we are modern day 12, except we are millions. We are millions. And so what began as 12 has exponentially grown, which is exactly what Jesus told them to do. Barring the martyrdom and things like that. Yeah. I mean, that's what we are. We're these disciples. And so in the end of the whole thing, what I'm going to challenge the congregation to do is to say, look at the 12. Which one are you? Well, which one are you more like?
I've done different programs to help us figure out our personality. And so it'd be kind of cool to see if there's a way to put together a profile where we can kind of figure out which one. And I think some of it we might be able to intuitively figure that out. But I've asked myself that question, and I haven't reached a conclusion yet.
We can create a spiritual Myers-Briggs.
There you go.
I had to take the Myers-Briggs before. As you go through the Commissioned Lay Pastor program in the Presbyterian Church, the first thing they do is you take the Myers-Briggs.
Wow.
And those things drive me crazy. So maybe we could do that. Maybe we could sit there and somehow make a very rudimentary, crude Myers-Briggs that says, in the end, they're out there. Spiritual inventories are out there, all kinds of things. And maybe there's one that says, okay, at the end, it pops up and says, you're Judas. That idea.
I'll have to Google that just to see if there's something in place, because
I bet there is.
It's just because they're I mean, the 12. They're such a big part of the New Testament.
Right. And I think one of the things, and hopefully the point is made when we're done with the series and we're done with this section of the podcasts, that you look at it and say, yes, they were unique. Yes, they were called by Jesus, which makes them privileged in their lives, not privileged as people, because obviously we know what they went through. But in the end, they are like us. And I think we have this tendency to take them and place them up. Because, just like in the Catholic Church, every one of them are saints. They're saints. They were special indeed. The founding fathers, you might say, children, the founding children. But in the end, they struggled, they doubted, they did all those types of things. And I just don't think that it's fair that we single out Thomas and say, my encouragement to everybody who's listening is, if you haven't heard the sermon, go on our Facebook. You can get on our Facebook by just going to Emmanuel Mennonite LJ. The sermon is there. The whole service is there. Look for October 22nd. Listen to the sermon. It's okay to doubt. It's okay to question. It's okay to... you and I are in a book study right now. In fact, we're going to go up there in just a few minutes. And the chapter that we happen to be doing this week talks about forgiving God and really kind of doubting and questioning what's God up to in my life. And I think we all do that. It doesn't make us less of a Christian. Sometimes I believe it makes us a stronger Christian on the other side of it.